Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Hello, welcome to the International Churchill Society podcast. Today, Executive Director Adam Howard sits down with Professor Richard Vinen, who will share his latest work, The Last Titans. Please like, share, subscribe, and enjoy the show. Check us out at winstonchurchill.org.
Welcome, everyone, to the End of the Beginning podcast. I'm very pleased that joining us today is Richard Vinen, Professor of History at King's College London and a former archive fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge. He's an award-winning author whose previous work, National Service, earned him the prestigious Wolfson History Prize. And his latest book, The Last Titans, is a fresh look at two of the most iconic figures of the 20th century, Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. While most historians treat these men as separate giants, Richard places them side by side and explores how they were leaders who understood that words and symbols are just as powerful as deeds. So I wish to welcome Richard. Thank you for joining us today. And it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, what fascinated me with your book, Richard, is you take these two, as you call them, the titans of the 20th century, and you note that after them we seem to get more leadership along these technocratic, bureaucratic lines, more managers versus these people who believed that they had the will, that they had the charisma, that they had the ability to use language and their image in a way that would actually move people and would lead people. And you describe, very interestingly, you note how de Gaulle referred to Churchill as an artist of history. In fact, I would have rooted for you to get that as the title of the book, as I think you tried.
Yeah, I did indeed.
But you talk about them, they're artists of history rather than just political leaders. I'm curious, which of the two do you think was more conscious, though, of crafting a public performance, and which was more likely to actually believe their own myth?
Well, I think they're both very conscious of crafting a performance. I think probably Churchill certainly at the end believes his own myth more than de Gaulle does. So I think de Gaulle is a more cold-blooded creature and is more kind of skeptical about most things in life. So I always think with de Gaulle, the key line in his memoirs, the line we always quote, the British always quote, is "all of my life I have had a certain idea of France," the opening line of his memoirs. But the next line is "like the princess in the fairy tale." So I think there's always a sense in which de Gaulle understands that kind of myths he's spinning are necessary myths, but he does understand their myths, that they're fairy tales in some sense.
With that in mind, and I know you described de Gaulle as sort of the austere and disciplined one of the two, and Churchill, of course, is exuberant. He's improvisational. I mean, that's how he builds so much of his reputation. How do those personality differences, though, affect the relationship? Because you do spend some time on, how they interacted, how they got along or didn't get along. How do you see those differences actually playing pivotal roles in terms of how they actually dealt with each other and engaged with each other?
So, I mean, I think partly, obviously, they're engaging with each other at a very particular kind of time. So 1940 is an exceptional moment. They meet in 1940 for the first time. They meet on the 9th of June, 1940, I think. So that, this is an extraordinary moment. France is being defeated. Britain is standing against defeat, but it's a close call for Britain. So that in that sense, there's a moment of kind of high drama. I think there's also then a shift in their relationship, which is partly to do with Churchill's sense of the need to fight a military war. I think de Gaulle is always fighting a more political war. De Gaulle has very few military resources at his disposal. And Churchill, therefore, comes to believe, quite rightly, that the United States is going to be crucial, is very exasperated when he thinks that de Gaulle is interfering with the relationship with the United States. So to some extent, their tensions and their relationship are to do with the circumstances they find themselves in. But they are also very different personalities. And I think personalities, they greatly admire each other, or at least at their best, they greatly admire each other. So they quarrel terribly at times. But Churchill, I think in a funny kind of way, one of the keys to Churchill is he's a romantic. And he sees de Gaulle as a romantic figure. And there are lots of ways in which de Gaulle stand in 1940 kind of alone, on his own, sentenced to death in his own country. is a very romantic stand. And that appeals to Churchill. The strange thing, though, is that de Gaulle is not a romantic about himself. So de Gaulle is much cooler in his kind of self-analysis. So there's a wonderful moment when the two men first meet, which they meet at a conference in Paris, or they meet, sorry, this is not the first meeting, but they meet at a conference in France as the French government is retreating down south. And Churchill has this wonderful description about seeing de Gaulle and saying, "Ah, the man of destiny." And de Gaulle says later on, no, Churchill never said that. And then he says, but Churchill was a romantic. So it's in a way Churchill's romanticism that makes him de Gaulle an appealing figure for him. And I suppose Churchill's most famous witticism about de Gaulle is to say, he thinks he's Joan of Arc, but I can't get my bloody bishops to burn him. Now, that's a lovely remark, but it's even more interesting in a way when you reflect that, of course, Churchill hugely admires Joan of Arc. And there's something about de Gaulle that stirs him. But I think also for that reason, sometimes he turns against de Gaulle very savagely. I think it's a kind of almost a tiff when he feels slighted by de Gaulle. And I think there are moments when also the fact that Churchill is such a Francophile, in a funny kind of way, makes him turn against de Gaulle. So Churchill loves France. Churchill sometimes, because he knows so many people in France, thinks there are other people in France who might represent France better than de Gaulle. So he's sometimes looking for an alternative to de Gaulle. But also, there is one person that Churchill especially thinks might represent France, and that is Churchill himself. So Churchill makes extraordinary speech to France in October 1940 when he speaks to the French people in French, or in Churchill's version of French, which is a very, very moving speech where you can see this is emotionally terribly important to Churchill. And so I think that too slightly kind of undermines at times the relationship with de Gaulle, Churchill's sense that he has himself a special relationship with France.
Well, on that note, when you talk about the emotion, I mean, obviously Churchill was never shy about showing his emotion. He would cry in public, on camera, because for him, that was part of, how he operated. You can argue it was maybe both sincere and it was something he did for effect. But it gave him, I think, a genuine emotional connection with his audiences, especially the British public, versus de Gaulle, who you've pointed out in the book, but also I think here, he kept the distance from the French people as part of his persona. How do you see the relationships with their publics based on those attitudes, the way they emoted? How did it shape their leadership and in terms of the connection with their individual audiences? And do you think it shaped their political fortunes as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So Churchill, as you say, is more openly emotional. Churchill, in a way, is an almost kind of pre-modern figure. So, his kind of intimacy with people he's dealing with is very striking. De Gaulle is always said never to have let other adult men see him naked. Whereas I always think you'd have to be a very lucky member of the English ruling class not to have seen Churchill naked. So Churchill is a kind of uninhibited figure. Churchill obviously has intimate relations with other members of the ruling class because he belongs to the ruling class. He's known some of these guys, knows Leo Amery since Churchill was 14 years old. De Gaulle is much more of an outsider. And Churchill is much more, as you say, openly emotional, informal in the way he communicates. So I think the speeches of 1940, I mean, wonderful speeches, but speeches which very much speak directly to his audience, in the language that comes naturally to his audience. So he speaks this very Anglo-Saxon, non-Latinate English. Of course, one of his great strengths is, unlike almost every other member of his class, he hasn't had his prose style ruined by a classical education, so he speaks very directly. George Orwell has this wonderful phrase about him. He says, Churchill's old-fashioned aristocratic language sounds to ordinary people like Cockney. And so he seems really to be speaking in their language. And there is something wonderful about Churchill's wit and humanity, and a kind of wit that is produced in the most mind-boggling circumstances. So there's a speech he makes in the House of Commons where he talks about the need to take precautions, the need to take precautions against bombing at this time when there's a terrible threat. And the House of Commons itself, he must take precautions. And then he suddenly comes out with his phrase where he says, of course, having 200 or 300 by-elections would be rather inconvenient at the present time. I think these are desperate circumstances, but he can make this joke about it. So that I think that is very appealing about him, and he always comes across. I was going to say even, but perhaps especially in desperate circumstances, as someone who's kind of full of animal spirit and an ability to be amusing, even in circumstances where you might think these are very somber times. De Gaulle is much more formal in his style. So de Gaulle sometimes adopts a language which is a consciously kind of archaic, impressive language, which I think he uses as a way of conveying a certain kind of formal authority. De Gaulle, of course, is always very conscious that, especially at first, he's rather bluffing, that he doesn't really have much power, and that therefore there's always a sense of artificiality about what he's doing. And de Gaulle, I think, well, both men perhaps consciously learned to be orators. So Churchill consciously learns to be an orator, particularly in the House of Commons. He's not at first a natural House of Commons speaker, and he has to train himself to do it. And there is, of course, this terrible moment early in his career where he freezes in front of the House of Commons and he can't speak, can't remember what he wants to say. An awful moment of humiliation, but that's very rare. De Gaulle is learning to speak in public at a late age, at 49 really, when he gives his first radio broadcast. And then this very early radio broadcast from London, which is just an extraordinary speech where he walks into a studio. They say test the microphones, rather like we were testing the microphones just then. And he just says, La France, one word, two words, and then makes this world-changing speech, almost kind of straight off. But thereafter, he says, no, I need to cultivate the art of broadcasting. So as a radio broadcaster in the war, and then as a television broadcaster in the late 50s and early 60s, he really kind of learns how to do things. So there's always, I suppose, a slightly more deliberate and conscious aspect of what de Gaulle is doing than Churchill.
Do you know if de Gaulle had any sort of mentor in the way? I know with Churchill, Burke Cochran was a huge influence on him when he was young, and obviously that helped him develop his style that became so famous. But de Gaulle, does he just do it out of nowhere, or does he have someone in particular that becomes an influence, or someone that might have been mentoring him in terms of becoming the order he became?
No, I don't think he quite does. He is said, when he's president of the Fifth Republic, to take kind of lessons from people at the Comédie Française. But he's always very careful to cultivate an air of mystery around himself. So he knows that part of the way he impresses people is not to fully let them know what he's done. So that this means how he speaks, also means how he writes. So, of course, Churchill's work goes through numerous drafts, is sent to lots of people. The process of writing itself is a very public process for Churchill. For de Gaulle, he very much likes the idea. He goes away, he writes his memoirs on his own, and then he produces a kind of perfect version at the end with no corrections. That, I think, very much illustrates the difference between these two men.
Well, staying on the theme of differences, I'm curious also about the differences when you look at you've mentioned Churchill in the House of Commons. He was already, by the time of the start of the war, he's been in the House of Commons 40 years at that point, whereas de Gaulle is a professional soldier. He comes to this very late in terms of a political career, and he famously distrusts, parties and parliamentary politics. How do those different attitudes when it comes to democracy, you think, shape the way each man handles those moments of national crisis that they both face?
So, I mean, I think Churchill is a Democrat, but a Democrat of a particular kind. So above all, Churchill is a parliamentarian. He's a great believer in the House of Commons. I think perhaps not always a complete believer in universal suffrage. Certainly female suffrage was something that at times he thought should be restrained. But belief in the House of Commons means that the House of Commons is, of course, very important to him during the war. And it's important in that some of his speeches are delivered, at least for the first time, in the House of Commons. And also, he's extraordinarily open to challenge. So he's having to speak in the House of Commons and answer questions in the House of Commons and subject himself to criticism in the House of Commons. So I think that is tremendously important to him. And I think that also goes with a more general feature of Churchill, which is that Churchill's always more of a team production than one might think. So I think Churchill is always surrounded by people who advise him, help him, and very importantly, especially during the war, disagree with him. So I think one of Churchill's great strengths is you have people who are willing to say, no, Winston, I don't think that's a good idea, and to argue their case when they have to do so. De Gaulle is much more solitary. So de Gaulle takes advice, but he sometimes takes it rather grudgingly. He sometimes doesn't like to admit the extent to which his ideas have been formed by debate. He, for example, hates to admit that the British have in fact sometimes controlled what he was allowed to say from London in the Second World War. And he's someone who is never a parliamentarian. He is a Democrat. And he, in fact, is the person in some ways responsible for universal suffrage in France, because women didn't have the vote before the Second World War. It's de Gaulle who gives them the vote. But he believes he has a direct relationship with the people, with the electorate, which, of course, is especially expressed in the Fifth Republic when he devises his own constitution through referenda. So he is a kind of almost a plebiscitary figure. Also, in some ways, a slightly monarchical figure, the kind of style of his politics. Of course, the one thing Churchill could never be is a head of state, and that's the one thing de Gaulle becomes. So in that sense, de Gaulle has this more kind of special, elevated role in his own constitution. So I think that makes a big difference between their styles. And I think de Gaulle, in the end, makes most of his decisions on his own. He thinks, he listens to advice, but in the end, he goes away and does his own thing. And sometimes his own aides are kind of completely astonished by the things he does.
That's interesting. So it sounds like from, I've seen it in the book, but also what you're saying, he's embedded in Britain's political establishment. De Gaulle, he seems to be building his authority outside existing systems. So do you think that's why, I think your takeaway is that de Gaulle's more flexible when confronting the realities of post-war Europe, the bipolar system that evolves, and that maybe de Gaulle's better at handling the decline of the French and its empire rather than Churchill's handling of the British and its decline of the British Empire?
I mean, I think, first of all, that they're in very different situations after 1945. So, first of all, de Gaulle, of course, is a lot younger, or at least he's a significant year. There's a big difference between being 55 and being 70, as I'm reluctantly beginning to recognize myself. And I think de Gaulle also has the advantage that he doesn't have this huge career behind him, so that he's not looking back to the same extent that Churchill is. I think Churchill also is exhausted at the end of the war. He's obviously had extraordinary war of travel, of agitating his subordinates and so on and so forth. I think also both Churchill and perhaps Britain are very locked in one thing. It always seems to me that Churchill's great speech, given on the same day as de Gaulle's great speech, the 18th of June, 1940, finishes with these words, the finest hour. People will still say this was our finest hour. And of course, that's a speech with a slight double edge, because it does imply that what's going to come after this moment of heroism is going to in some way be a decline. So I think there is always a sense that Churchill has lived through his great heroic moment in 1940, and it's hard to recapture that. I think, by contrast, de Gaulle is never nostalgic for 1940. He knows 1940 is a moment of defeat and humiliation for France. He doesn't particularly want to be reminded of it, and he doesn't like the idea of himself as a kind of public monument built to commemorate the past. He wants France to be moving into the future. And in some ways, this is ironic, because de Gaulle, much more than Churchill, is a man of the Ancien Régime, really a man, in some ways, whose idea of France dates back before the French Revolution of 1789. I think there's a strange way in which that makes life easier for de Gaulle. So he's a nostalgic, but he's a nostalgic who knows that the world which he's nostalgic for has been blown away by history. It can't be recreated. So I think he's kind of doomed to be flexible, if you like, doomed to be pragmatic. And I think that's one of his great strengths after 1945.
It's interesting that I appreciate that he wants to move forward. Of course, all the humiliation that comes with 1940, and yet for him, it's such a remarkable moment, because Churchill famously played a weak hand into a strong hand, but de Gaulle played a nothing hand into a significant hand. So it seems like it's his shining moment. But to your point, I can see why, in general terms, for France, it's not going to be something that he wants to linger on or spend much time focusing on, despite his success initially in really developing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you're right to say a nothing hand is what he plays initially. Um, I think he doesn't necessarily want to be remembered for that. I mean, his abilities in 1940 are extraordinary abilities, but they're abilities, in some ways, the abilities of a poker player to play with this very weak hand. I think de Gaulle would much rather in 1940 have been Churchill. He'd much rather have been leading a country that resisted heroically against the possible odds than representing a country which had suffered defeat.
Now, I know the book focuses, of course, on Churchill and de Gaulle and their relationship, but I'm curious, and you touched on it earlier, what about Churchill and FDR? Because obviously that was a contentious relationship. But what are your takeaways? Was it more de Gaulle felt he had to present himself this way, not only to the British, but the United States, as France is not a junior partner, and that's why he felt he had to do the things he did, including irritating FDR? Or do you feel like there's more to it in terms of that relationship with President Roosevelt?
So I think partly de Gaulle is unromantic about the United States. I think Churchill is never, I mean, Churchill is never as romantic as he pretends to be about the United States, but nonetheless, he's got an American mother. He's been to the United States a great deal, and it does mean a lot to him. And he does, I think, see the United States in some ways as the kind of successor to Britain. And I think he is emotionally attached to FDR. I mean, he describes it to Colville, to his private secretary after the war. He talks about himself, says no lover ever wooed his mistress as assiduously as I wooed Roosevelt. But of course, the thing about wooing a lover is that you do eventually fall in love with the object you're wooing. And I think there is a sense in which Churchill falls in love with Roosevelt and does say, you know, Roosevelt's the greatest man I've ever known. And I think that's not necessarily an insincere remark. But he also knows, obviously, that British survival depends on the United States. De Gaulle, I think, has always a more cold-blooded view of the United States. He sees it as a massive kind of industrial arsenal, but he doesn't see it as a beacon of freedom in the way I think Churchill sees the United States. And I think also de Gaulle does exasperate Roosevelt. I slightly suspect there's more respect between them than might meet the eye. So Churchill, when he's trying to persuade de Gaulle to be nicer to Roosevelt, nicer to the United States, just before D-Day, says Roosevelt described you as a mystic. And I think there probably are ways in which Roosevelt does understand that de Gaulle, never a romantic, is a mystic. He has a kind of religious sense of his own country. And as for de Gaulle's understanding of Roosevelt, I think he understands that Roosevelt is running this huge war stretching all around the globe. So there is a moment when de Gaulle speaks to the American ambassador in the 1950s, and he describes the arguments he has with Roosevelt, and he says, we were both right. You know, I had to act the way I did to defend French kind of dignity, and he had to act the way he did because he got a war to run, and because he had all these kind of multiple pieces on the chessboard. And I think de Gaulle understood that under those circumstances, France, and especially Free France, could only be a pawn on that chessboard.
Interesting. Well, let me go further into the issue of the relationship between these leaders and their military leadership, because you've got Churchill, who, although he had a military background, at least at this point, is in the civilian position. De Gaulle, of course, professional soldier from the time before the war and obviously during the war. Do you see one operating in a way that's actually better serving their futures in terms of how they interacted with their leadership, their generals, one being, you know, more flexible, or maybe one being less open to listening to their generals, and how that might have reflected in terms of how they understood power and leadership, but also how that ultimately led their countries both during the war and even after?
So I think they have very different relations with the military. So Churchill, as you say, is really a civilian politician from the age of 25. But of course, he's a man who has been formed by a very romantic background as a soldier, a sort of cavalry officer riding in the last cavalry charge of the British Army, really. Right. And there's always a bit of Churchill that would quite like to go back to being a soldier. So he's always keen to kind of take command himself, to intervene directly. And I think this is partly why people's willingness to argue with him matters so much. So the willingness of his military advisors, obviously particularly Allenbrook, to argue against him is very important. But also, of course, Churchill is running a real war effort in 1940 and, well, for some time afterwards. So military matters do really impinge on Britain's future. You know, the question of whether or not Britain can sustain invasion, the question of what Britain's going to do in North Africa. These things are absolutely life-changing decisions for Churchill's country, and he can't afford to be indifferent to military matters. De Gaulle, by contrast, I think, first of all, very unexpectedly, although he's been a professional soldier, one of the themes of de Gaulle's life, right back when he was a prisoner of war in the First World War, and he was a German prisoner, and he kind of had time to think, one of the themes he emphasizes is that civilian power must rule the military. And he says the thing that goes wrong with Germany in the First World War is they let the generals take over. And in fact, I think he always thinks that civilian politicians must keep the military in line. Remember that when he's appointed as the most junior member of the French government in 1940, so he's a very junior minister, and he's been a junior minister of about 48 hours. One of the things he does is attempt to sack or consider sacking Weygand, the most senior general in the French army. And that's very characteristic of his view. And he has this wonderful phrase, Weygand says, "Is that your suggestion?" And de Gaulle says the government does not make suggestions, it gives instructions. So that sums up his kind of view. And then, of course, that's reinforced because he's deprived of his military. There are really very few soldiers with him in 1940. So he always knows the kind of role he's going to be playing in London is largely a political role. And I think the British hope he's going to be the leader of a kind of foreign legion. He's going to take a few thousand soldiers into combat on their side. Whereas he thinks, I'm going to be the political representative of France. And he's not actually very directly involved in his generals. He's also very notably indifferent to military rank. So when de Gaulle comes over, one of the things the British say about him is that he's a general de brigade. He's actually, in British terms, a brigadier rather than a general. And they sometimes use that to slightly put him down. They say this is not a very senior rank, really. But the striking thing is, de Gaulle never tries to change his rank. He obviously could just have promoted himself. Leclerc, who comes over as a captain, goes back to Paris as a general. And de Gaulle is just mildly amused by this fact. But he doesn't attempt himself to acquire a higher military rank. He says, when a socialist politician comes out of France and says, "We admire you in spite of the fact you're a general, not because you're a general," de Gaulle replies, "I'm above the hierarchy of the military." So I think he always sees himself in that way. And he's always, in fact, surprisingly detached about military matters, except for insisting that his government must impose its authority on the army. And of course, this becomes very important during the Algerian War when he rules France, when in the period 58 to 62, when, after all, he actually puts down a military putsch in 1961, and then spends a great deal of the next couple of years surviving a succession of assassination attempts by ex-soldiers. So de Gaulle comes into very direct conflict with his own military in a way that would have been kind of inconceivable for Churchill.
I'm curious also about the issue of legacy. I think one of the things that's really interesting in your book is how both men consciously try to shape their history through memoirs, through speeches. They recognize the importance of symbolism. How successful would you assess they were in controlling that historical legacy? I mean, there's over 1,000 books on Churchill. I think it's in the hundreds for de Gaulle. So obviously there are many people who are compelled by their stories, but I'm curious from your assessment, the success in terms of how they themselves controlled it in terms of what it's become today.
I mean, I think they're both enormously successful, which is why we're talking about them, of course. Churchill is always very conscious of himself as a historical actor. So, I mean, I love the detail that when he rides into battle in the Sudan, he leaves a lancer riding behind the main body of troops, so there'll be someone to tell his story if he's killed in action. Of course, both men, I think, are very conscious early in their life that they might well be killed in action. So they're always thinking about their own mortality. They're always thinking about their afterlife in kind of a literal sense, how they're going to be remembered after their death. I think they're slightly different in that Churchill is very keen to kind of tell his own story. And I think things like the Dardanelles makes him very conscious of the idea that one day you might have to justify what you're doing, and you might therefore lead a kind of written audit trail. So this marvellous moment when a civil servant in exasperation in 1940, reading one of Churchill's sort of very sonorous phrases in an official document, says, Winston always thinking of his books, knowing, of course, that historians are going to cite what he says in the archives one day. De Gaulle, I think, by contrast, sees creating a memory around de Gaulle as actually a political act which is designed to serve France in the future. So he writes his most important volumes of war memoirs at a time when he's out of power and when it seems likely he'll never come back to power. So I think he thinks this is like his last service to France, to provide a written account. But it's, in a strange way, it's not a self-aggrandizing account. I mean, I say at the beginning of the book that no one will ever believe me when I tell you this, but in a strange way, de Gaulle, for all his extraordinary kind of mannerisms and apparent arrogance, he's a modest man about himself. He makes great demands when he feels he's speaking for France, but not great demands about de Gaulle as an individual. And he often speaks about de Gaulle in the third person, almost as if the public de Gaulle is a kind of artificial creation that he knows has to be created, but which perhaps at times he himself finds a bit tiresome. It's very striking when he describes him coming back to power in 1958. And if you compare it with Churchill, I felt I'd been walking with destiny. Churchill described himself coming back in 1940 as if this was a completely natural consummation. De Gaulle describes himself coming back in 1958 and says, "So be it, in spite of all my weaknesses, my age, the gaps in my knowledge, I would serve France as best I could." So I think for de Gaulle, the great figure in his own memoirs is actually not de Gaulle, it's the personality of France.
What I find so interesting with de Gaulle, especially after reading what you had to write about him, when you look at great individuals who change history versus systemic forces, I mean, de Gaulle's real claim to fame to me seems to be more, or at least in terms of substantive impact, is after the war, because Free France isn't necessarily pivotal to Allied success versus Churchill, who at least from 1940 to 1941, I don't see how you can't have Churchill and at least have the British in a position where the Soviets enter the war and then the United States enter the war. And then you can make the argument, perhaps it's systemic forces that ultimately are going to decide the outcome. But I'm curious from your perspective, for de Gaulle, World War II is obviously important enough in terms of shaping a story of de Gaulle, back to your point about the narrative. But in terms of impact, it seems to me it's really after, and as you pointed out, he was younger in World War II than Churchill, so there's that element as well. He has more time that he's going to be playing an impact well into the late 1960s. But is your takeaway as well the idea that de Gaulle, his story is important in terms of building his own reputation during the war, but not necessarily the impact until after the war?
I think that's probably right. France would have been liberated whether de Gaulle was there or not.
Right.
France would not necessarily have been liberated as a victor power. I mean, France might have been liberated in the way that Italy was, as a kind of half-conquered power. Right. So I think that's de Gaulle's great achievement. So I think things like France's seat on the UN Security Council are very much de Gaulle's legacy, really. Churchill, I agree, Churchill's central to the Second World War, central in military terms, but also I think there's a particular moral importance to Churchill. So I've just been rereading Luce's article, The American Century. And what strikes me is that Luce is writing about the period that is going to be dominated by the United States. The United States is about to become the world's great power. And yet he begins talking about Churchill. And you realize that it's enormously important, quite apart from just military survival for Britain, which was not something you could take for granted in 1940, I don't think. I know there's a fashionable school that says Britain could never really have been invaded. I think the British do, in fact, think there's a real danger of invasion in 1940. But apart from that, Luce writes and says, he begins that essay writing about Churchill. And there is this sense of Churchill representing this kind of absolute moral heroism in this very unusual moment. And you can see that Roosevelt comes to help Churchill in enormous ways and provide all sorts of material aid to Churchill. But there's also a sense in which, in moral terms, Churchill kind of appeals to the United States. It's very important, I think, for the way the United States reacts to Britain, that it should be seen as this great centre of heroism in 1940. And that's what Churchill is very, very good at incarnating. So in that sense, I think Churchill makes this fantastic difference during the Second World War. De Gaulle, as you say, makes less of a difference. He makes a difference, I think, in two respects. He makes a difference in terms of the French resistance. So he does become the great symbol of resistance inside France. And he also, I think, in a curious kind of way, in the end, becomes appealing to the very ruling class entourage that surround Churchill. So I think people like Anthony Eden ultimately come to admire de Gaulle and to say, we have to throw our lot in with de Gaulle. There's a wonderful moment when Desmond Morton, Churchill's advisor, writes to someone else about de Gaulle, and he finishes with this very strange phrase, which I don't cite in the book, and it's one of those phrases I don't quite know what to make of. But he says, at the end of his letter, he says, de Gaulle is not a bastard, de Gaulle is France. And I feel that sums up how a lot of the British ruling class come to think of de Gaulle. But then, of course, after the war, as you say, de Gaulle becomes the great peacetime leader. So de Gaulle really reconstructs his country, reconfigures his country after 1958. And so I suppose there's always a touch of envy in these men's relationships. And you could always say that de Gaulle would have loved to be Churchill in 1940. But Churchill would have loved to be de Gaulle in 1958. He would have loved to be the great peacetime leader.
I'm curious, though, on that point, let's say 1958, would Churchill, though, because it seems to me one of the things you show is that de Gaulle maybe should get credit for how he's more flexible in terms of handling the decline of French power in the post-war period. Churchill seems like to the very last day of his life, he is fighting to keep the old British Empire in place. Would he actually have wanted to be in that position had he been able to serve in the late 50s into the 60s, when he would have had to have overseen the dismantling of the British Empire, something that, for him was just heartbreaking?
It's hard to know. So you're right. He's much more sentimental about the empire than de Gaulle is about the French Empire. Of course, it's very hard to compare them. So in 1958, Churchill is 84. He's older than de Gaulle is when he dies.
Right.
So in that sense, obviously, Churchill cannot do things by that time. I think Churchill, in a curious kind of way, Churchill flickers in his view of the British Empire. So it does actually say when he meets de Gaulle in November 1944 in Paris, there's this strange conversation about empire in which Churchill says, empire sometimes can cost more than it delivers, as India has shown us. So I think there is a sense in which Churchill is beginning to evolve to seeing that maybe empire is gone. I think he regrets it. I think you're right to say he would have found it painful. He probably couldn't have been as flexible as de Gaulle, but he does to some extent recognize that empire is gone. And he does, of course, have a very unexpectedly close relationship with post-independence, especially Indian leaders. So, he receives Nehru in London in the late 1940s. So there is a sense in which Churchill might have lived with, a post-imperial reality, I think.
Agreed. I think he would have had to have lived with it. I just think he would have probably been more disconcerted in terms of having to usher it in or live through it as a leader. But your point's well taken.
I agree. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and your point's well taken. But I'm curious. I want to conclude with maybe the impossible question. But if you had to sum up for you these two leaders, do you see one as having been more successful as a statesman, whether it be by the building their own narrative, the myth that they left behind, or you could judge it essentially by what you thought they did in substance as statesmen in terms of how they ran their countries and how they dealt with this new world order that came to be both with World War II and in the immediate years after the war?
So, I think their achievements are incredibly different. So it always seems to me that Churchill is a man of mind-boggling gifts in sort of every area. And it's almost like, the good fairies have gathered round his cradle and said, he will have all these gifts, he'll be eloquent and brave and so on and so forth. And then a bad fairy has said, but he'll be wrong about almost everything. And then a last good fairy says, but the one thing he'll be right about will be the most important issue of the whole 20th century and perhaps, one of the big issues of history. So, if you're only going to be right about one thing, being right about fighting Nazism and holding out in 1940 is a very, very big thing to be right about. De Gaulle is a more complicated figure, I think. So de Gaulle is wrong about lots of things, right about lots of things, and is a more, as you say, a figure more capable of adjusting as time goes on. And also, of course, de Gaulle is dealing with a different kind of country. So he's dealing with a country that needs to be reconstructed. Now, perhaps in some ways, reconstruction becomes a benefit for France. The need to move on becomes something that's actually useful for France. But de Gaulle partly sees that, I think. I think also de Gaulle when we talked about the kind of difference in big structural changes and changes that might be affected by a great leader, de Gaulle, I think, does ultimately recognize that big structural changes are very important. So he does recognize that things like changed economy in post-war France is important. I think he recognizes that Europe is important to France. He recognizes that the European community as it becomes is important. Doesn't like it, but he knows he has to live with it. So de Gaulle is better at living with things he doesn't necessarily completely like.
Well, I'm glad we could conclude there, because I think you've highlighted really the key elements with both these leaders. I want to thank you, Richard, for a great conversation. I hope those of you listening or watching will go out, buy Richard's book, Last of the Titans, learn more about these two formidable leaders. And if you enjoyed the content that we covered here today, I encourage you to like, subscribe, share this interview, and also consider becoming a member of the International Churchill Society. If you go to winstonchurchill.org, you can become a member and review on our website remarkable material we have covering Churchill's life and legacy. So thank you for listening, and thank you, Richard, for joining us.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for the International Churchill Society's podcast. Please share this, subscribe, like, follow us on social media, and check us out at winstonchurchill.org.